I saw that white horse emerge from the fog, one eye blind, the other staring straight into my soul. It feared no wind, no screaming. It simply bowed beside me while blood ran down my legs. No one knew where it came from, but it was the one that pulled me from the dark and led me to where I was finally called human. If you think this is just a fairy tale, you're wrong. Subscribe now to uncover the whole haunting truth. The screen opens in darkness. A low rumble, far-off thunder crawls through the silence. Then, faintly, the sound of hooves. Slow at first, then pounding hooves slamming against wet earth, striking roots and slipping over stone. The camera follows nothing but fog and sound. Then, crack. A sudden bolt of lightning slashes across the treetops, revealing a blur of movement in the forest. Rain crashes down, then sharpens into ice. Hail. White pellets burst against branches, ricocheting off bark, tumbling across the ground like marbles let loose from the sky. And through this chaos, a sleek white blur vanishes between pine trunks. A single eye, gleaming pale gold in the dark, looks back for just a second. Cut to a black SUV idling on a muddy trail, tires sinking slowly into the soft terrain. The back passenger door is open. Inside, a small girl, Lily Hart, 8 years old, sits hunched, arms wrapped tightly around a backpack that's far too small to be useful. She doesn't cry. She doesn't scream. She just trembles, like a rabbit sensing the shadow of a hawk. Standing outside the car, Madeline, her stepmother, leans in with a forced smile. Her eyeliner smears slightly from the rain, but her voice is cool, calculated. "All right, sweetie, it's a little game, okay? Just hop out. I'll be right back." Lily doesn't move. Madeline's fingers tighten around the girl's arm. Not enough to bruise yet, but enough to warn. "Out. Now." Lily lets go of the backpack. One foot touches the ground, then the other. Her sneakers sink an inch into the mud, and the hail immediately begins to bounce off her thin windbreaker. Where are we going?" Lily's voice is a whisper, barely audible beneath the crackling of frozen rain. Madeline doesn't answer. She just shuts the door, clicks it locked, and without another word, the SUV reverses, tires screeching, fishtailing slightly on the ice-slicked path, and then gone. The red glow of the taillights fades into fog. Lily stands motionless in the middle of the woods, as hail smacks her cheeks, her arms, her head. She blinks up at the trees, confused. There's no trail, no road, no houses, just her, and the woods, and the storm. She shivers. A high, sharp sound escapes her throat, not quite a sob. More like the sound you make when you're trying not to cry, but your lungs forget how to breathe. She takes a step forward, then another. Branches whip at her jacket. Pine needles catch in her hair. The camera closes in on her feet, white sneakers soaked and streaked with mud. She stumbles, almost falls. Her breathing turns shallow. Short flashes burst in her memory, disconnected, hazy. Her real mother's arms, wrapping around her under the covers, whispering something about stars and lullabies. A song. A melody she can't quite recall, buried under years of silence. Then, snap, the earth gives way. A hidden dip in the trail. She falls down, fast, a tangle of limbs, branches, and a sickening crack. She lands hard. A flash of light, then darkness, then light again. She tries to sit up, but something's wrong. Her right leg screams. Her jeans are torn at the knee. Blood smears down her shin, bright against the soaked denim. Her hands reach for support, fingers sinking into wet leaves. She opens her mouth. Nothing comes out. The panic builds like a pressure wave in her chest, tight, paralyzing. Her eyes dart left, right, up, no sign of the road. No trail, no mother. Not even a sound anymore, but the hail, the wind, and her pulse, now pounding inside her ears. Then it hits. Not the storm, the fear, the real kind. The one you don't name because naming it makes it real. Her vision warps. The woods begin to pulse, expanding and contracting like lungs. The trees aren't trees anymore. They're figures, tall and faceless, watching. She tries to scream. Nothing. Her throat is locked. A sob catches halfway, strangled by panic. And then, a whisper. Not a voice, not human, but something. A low, rhythmic thump in the distance, syncopated with the hail. Thump. 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 She blinks, holds her breath. There's something moving through the trees. The thump grows louder. Hoofbeats? Or is her mind playing tricks? She crawls backward, dirt and blood streaking her hands. Her injured leg drags behind her like a lifeless weight. Suddenly, a flash of white in the fog. Stillness. The hail stops. The storm, almost miraculously, dies to a drizzle. Only the sound of pine branches shaking loose the ice remains. Lily squints. Through the mist, it appears. A horse, large, muscular, white as fresh snow except for a deep scar running down its left eye. That eye is closed, clouded over. The other eye, sharp and golden, stares directly into her. The creature doesn't snort or stomp. It doesn't run. It stands completely still. Lily's breath catches in her throat. She's frozen. Not from fear this time, but something else. Something older, primitive. As if her body recognizes this creature before her mind can. The horse takes one step forward, then another. It lowers its head slightly. She watches, unblinking, tears mingling with the rain on her face. Finally, her voice returns. "Are you real?" The horse stops a few feet away. She reaches out a trembling hand. The horse leans forward. Its breath warms her palm. It's real. Very real. Suddenly, Lily collapses forward, body giving out from shock and blood loss. The camera follows as her vision blurs fog, consuming her field of view. The world spins. Before her face hits the ground, the horse steps closer and catches her with its shoulder. Then, astonishingly, the horse kneels. Its legs fold beneath it, slow and deliberate. Its back now low enough for the girl to climb on. Lily doesn't move. Not yet. But she opens her eyes. The pain in her leg is unbearable, but instinct tells her what to do. She crawls one movement at a time onto the horse's back. The camera stays close. Every breath from her is labored, every movement etched in pain. Finally, she lays across its back, gripping the coarse mane. She doesn't know where it's going, or what it is, but it's not the forest. It's not alone. The horse stands, strong, solid, a guardian from the mist. It begins to walk. With every step, the mist thickens behind them, swallowing the bloody footprints, the broken branches, the shattered innocence. And in front, only the pathless forest. The screen fades to black. Echoes remain. The sound of hooves, and the faint voice of a child whispering into the mane, "Don't leave me." Darkness blinks, but not complete. There's light, soft, distant, like a memory you can't place but still feel in your bones. The sound of wind rustling wet pine needles blends with the faint whimper of a wounded child. Lily's face is pale, streaked with dirt, blood, and melting hail. Her breath comes in short, shallow gasps. Her lips are cracked, her fingers clenched into the leaves. Her right leg is twisted unnaturally under her, and her jacket sticks to her back, damp from both rain and sweat. She's slipping into shock, into silence. Then, a shift in the mist. Soft, subtle, as if the fog itself took form and stepped forward. A shape emerges, not fast, not loud, just present. Like it had always been there, waiting, only now choosing to be seen. A white horse, towering, still, muddied at the hooves but gleaming in the soft silver of the post-storm sky. One eye is clouded over, veined like cracked ice, the other burns gold. The horse doesn't snort, doesn't stamp, just sees her. Lily stirs, barely able to lift her head. Her vision swims, a tree, a white blur, a shape from a storybook. Am I dead? Am I dreaming? She blinks slowly. The horse is closer now. It steps through the trees without sound, the fog parting for it like reverence. It stops at her side. Lily flinches. But the horse doesn't move. It lowers its head, so close now she can see the fine ridges of old scars beneath the white fur. It studies her, and then, gently, it presses the soft curve of its muzzle against her shoulder. A nudge, not playful, not forceful, just a touch. The kind of touch that says, "I know you're hurt, but you're not alone." Lily gasps. It isn't pain that makes her cry out, it's the relief. She lets her forehead fall into the crook of her arm, sobbing without sound. The horse pulls back slightly, then, astonishingly, lowers itself. Its legs fold inward, joints creaking, body flattening gently into the earth. A motion rare for a wild creature, intentional, slow. It kneels beside her, as if inviting, as if saying, "Get on." But Lily doesn't move, can't. Her limbs are water, her mind a blur of cold and confusion. And still, the horse waits. Minutes pass. She can't tell how many. The wind softens, the trees still whisper. But now, all she hears is the rhythm of the horse's breath, a warmth, a presence. She reaches out. Her hand trembles, dirty fingernails scratching through the mist. Her palm touches its side. The horse doesn't flinch. She pushes, inches herself up, one elbow, then the other. She gasps, pain flaring through her ribs but doesn't stop. With a desperate crawl, she drapes herself awkwardly over the horse's back. Her leg screams, her side aches. But the horse stays still. When she's halfway on, barely balanced across its back like a sack of broken bones, the horse rises. Steady, grounded, a silent pillar in a forest of ghosts. Lily moans. Her fingers grip its mane not out of control, but out of need. She feels the thickness of the strands, the life in the creature beneath her. The horse begins to walk, no urgency, no fear. Each step is calculated, purposeful. The forest isn't clear. The fog is thick as wool, but the horse moves like it knows this place, like it's walked this path before, with other burdens on its back, like it's following memory, not map. Lily's head rests on its neck. She's half conscious, her mind drifting. The world fades into slivers of sound, branches brushing its sides, rain dripping off leaves, the crunch of hoof on brittle pine needles. Then something unexpected, an image forming through the haze. Up ahead, glass. No, not glass. A hole in something solid. A window, light amber and faint spills through broken slats. The shape of a roof rises. Then a bell tower. An old cross. A church, or what's left of one. The horse walks closer. The fog curls around the building like it's part of the earth, part of the memory of the forest. The old chapel leans slightly to one side, shingles missing, ivy swallowing the stone, the bell above rusted in place, and yet it glows. Not with anything supernatural, but with that kind of weary dignity that comes from still being here, when everything else is gone. The horse stops just at the steps. Lily lifts her head. The doors are missing. The interior is dark, but not threatening. The light from above filters through broken windows and collapsed beams. Dust dances in the air. The horse kneels again. She knows what it wants. Her fingers open. Release the mane. She slides down painfully but lands on her knees with a soft thud. She crawls forward, her body stiff and shaking. The horse stays behind her, watching. Inside the chapel, a wooden pew remains upright. Just one. She drags herself toward it, then collapses at its base. The camera pulls back slowly, showing the fragile body of a child lying beneath the fractured stained glass of a forgotten church. A silent horse standing guard just beyond the doorway. For a while, nothing moves. Just mist. And time. Then, a figure in the shadows. Faint. Not quite visible. Not yet. But, watching. From the back of the chapel, the wind shifts through the rafters, lifting cobwebs. The horse turns its head. It knows. Someone else is here. The chapel was quiet again. Not with peace, but with the tension of something waiting to be understood. Rain slid in rivulets down the stained glass fragments, still clinging to the frame above the pulpit. Purple light flickered across the cracked wood. Dust hung suspended, glowing like fireflies caught in amber. Lily lay curled beside the first pew, one cheek pressed against the stone floor, her breath shallow, fingers twitching involuntarily. The blood from her knee had crusted, but the wound itself still pulsed with every heartbeat. Her other leg trembled under the weight of her body. She didn't cry, didn't speak. Her eyes stayed open, glassy and distant. The silence was broken by a door creaking open on rusted hinges. A figure stepped out from the far corridor, tall, lean, wrapped in a faded brown coat too long for his frame. The hood shadowed half his face, but not the gray beard or the deep lines etched around his mouth. His steps echoed on the stone tiles, not heavy, not rushed, just certain. He moved with the quiet presence of someone who had lived in this silence so long, he had become part of it. This was Father Raymond, or what remained of him. He didn't speak, not at first. He just stood there, watching the small, broken girl lying beneath the light, and the white horse echo, waiting silently just beyond the chapel entrance, half shrouded in fog. Raymond's head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then his hand rose slowly and adjusted a hearing aid behind his left ear. It gave a faint buzz. His right ear, he didn't bother with. That one hadn't worked in years. A childhood infection. Unfixable. He walked forward slowly, deliberately. His boots made soft sounds against stone as he approached the girl. He crouched, his knees creaking, and placed a calloused hand gently on Lily's forehead. She flinched but didn't recoil. She wasn't registering, not entirely. Shock had set in. Her skin was cold to the touch, her lips blue at the edges. He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist. Pulse. Light. Erratic. His other hand slid beneath her chin and tilted her face into the light. Pupils sluggish. He reached for the hem of her torn jeans. Her leg was badly bruised, knee swollen, shin scraped raw. Bone not broken but close. He sighed, almost to himself. Then, finally, his voice dry as old paper, but precise. "You brought me another one, didn't you?" He turned his head toward the doorway, where Echo stood motionless, one golden eye fixed on the girl. That cloudy left eye blinked once. Raymond's lips twisted not quite a smile. "You just don't stop, do you?" He stood. No more words. Action, now. He turned, crossed the chapel, and disappeared into the corridor. The sound of cabinets opening, something metal clattering, drawers sliding, a bucket filled. Footsteps returned. He emerged carrying a battered first aid kit, a wool blanket, and a tin basin of warm water. He knelt beside Lily again. Gently, without speaking, he wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, Then, he dipped a rag into the water and began cleaning the blood from her leg. He worked with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this thousands of times before, not with detachment but with ritual. Disinfectant. Gauze. Tape. She moaned once. He stopped immediately. Waited. Her eyes opened just barely. Still silent. She didn't move. Didn't fight. Didn't help. She just watched him with the blank, stunned look of someone who had seen too much in too little time. He set the bandages aside. Then, as he moved to reposition her jacket for warmth, he noticed it. Not the wound on her leg. Something else. A sliver of scar tissue, just below her left ribs, barely visible beneath her shirt. Thin, pale, surgical. His brow furrowed. He hesitated. Then he lifted the hem slightly, only an inch, exposing a perfect, clinical incision scar. About 3 inches long. He stared at it. That wasn't a childhood accident. That was a surgical scar. Recent, maybe a few years old. But too clean, too precise. His fingers hovered above it. Not touching, just observing. That scar did not belong on the body of an 8-year-old girl. Not unless something had been taken from her. Or put inside her. Raymond's eyes narrowed. He sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly. Lily didn't look at him. She stared past him toward the wall. Or through it. Her lips moved, just barely. A single breath of sound escaped her mouth so soft it was barely audible. Mommy. Raymond froze. The word wasn't for him. It wasn't even for her mother. It was for the memory. She whispered it again. Her eyes still unfocused. Her voice cracking. Mommy. He placed his hand lightly over hers. Not to hold her, just to anchor her. You're safe here, he said, softly. But Lily didn't answer. She shut her eyes. And the silence returned. Not dead silence, just wounded. He sat there for several minutes, watching her breathe. The fog shifted through the open doorway behind him. Echo had not moved. Raymond stood. He crossed the chapel again, grabbed a lantern, lit it, and placed it beside her. The warm light cast long shadows over the pews, crawling up the walls, giving the ruined chapel a fragile sense of sanctuary. Then he turned toward Echo. Stepped outside. The horse raised its head slightly. Raymond looked at it not as a man looks at an animal, but as a man looks at an old companion. You found her, didn't you? He murmured. You always know where the broken ones are. The horse didn't move, but in the wind, something shifted. Not in sound, but in memory. Raymond looked back at the girl, then back to the horse. I don't know where you're taking me with this one, he muttered, running a hand through his beard. But something's off. That scar. He trailed off, then turned back inside. He shut the chapel door not to close it, but to seal the cold out. And then for the first time in a very long while, he knelt at the front of the chapel, beneath the fractured stained glass, and whispered something not even the horse could hear. Not a prayer, but a promise, to not look away this time. The chapel was silent, but not asleep. Rain had eased into a dull mist. The wind had softened to whispers, brushing across the broken beams like fingers across old piano keys. Lily lay curled on the cot Raymond had dragged from the sacristy. The wool blanket clung to her like armor. Her lips were parted, her breathing shallow but steady. A small basin beside her cot caught the bloodied bandages and dirty water. Her injured leg, now properly splinted, peeked out from beneath the blanket. Echo stood just beyond the doorway, visible only as a shifting silhouette in the fog, a lone eye glowing like a coal. Watching, always watching. Inside, Raymond sat alone near a dusty shelf cluttered with broken radios, cassette players, and an old television one with the wood-paneled frame and rust-colored dials. The kind that required patience and strength to operate. He clicked it on. Static hissed. He adjusted the antenna. The picture blinked into life-gray shadows resolving into color. News anchor. Breaking story. The search continues for 8-year-old Lily Hart, presumed missing after family members claim she wandered from a remote vacation site outside Helena. The father, Dean Hart, made a plea earlier today. The screen cut to a press conference outside a suburban home in Montana. A man mid-40s, clean-shaven, blue polo tucked into khakis, stood at a podium, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and a woman with mascara smudged into her cheekbones. Dean Hart. He looked devastated. Too devastated. Raymond leaned closer. On screen, the man spoke into the mic, voice strained with emotion. Lily, if you're out there, please know we love you. You're not in trouble. We just want you to come home. He sniffled. His eyes glistened. His lips quivered with just enough restraint to seem heroic. The camera zoomed in, and that's when Raymond saw it. Not in the man's eyes, but in his hands. Tightly clenched, knuckles white, fingers flexing between each syllable like he was fighting not to crush the podium. Raymond's jaw tightened. He had seen grief. Real grief. He had also seen performance. This was the second kind. Behind the man, the woman Madeline was too perfect. Her hands trembled just enough to appear fragile, but her nails were manicured, her blouse too pressed, her stance too rehearsed. Raymond leaned back slowly in his chair. Echo snorted outside. The sound made the screen flicker slightly. Raymond didn't look away. He reached under the desk and opened a drawer. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a small cassette recorder. Its leather strap cracked, its buttons worn thin. He took it out, set it on the table, and loaded an old tape labeled H9 Infant Case 2007. Click, whir. A voice crackled to life. Younger, male, official. Report from St. Helena Regional. Infant identity mismatch flagged. Suspected misfile during postnatal transfer. 2 children. 1 incubated, 1 released. Case sealed per hospital request. Pause. Another voice. Female. Nervous. They told me she died. They told me my daughter didn't make it. Then another calm. Sterile. There was a surgical scar on the infant that didn't match any charted procedure. We were advised not to pursue further documentation. Raymond's hand hovered over the speaker grill. His eyes narrowed. He rewound the tape 10 seconds and played it again. There was a surgical scar on the infant that didn't match. He hit stop, turned toward the cot. Lily, still sleeping, still silent, but her hand had moved just slightly, clenched. Inside her dream, Lily was back in a corridor. White walls stretched endlessly in both directions. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, flickering with an unnatural rhythm. Her feet were bare, cold linoleum beneath her toes. A wristband on her arm, the plastic tag dangling with faded ink. She walked forward toward the sound of crying. Not hers. Someone else. Behind a door. She pushed it open. A hospital room. 2 cribs. 1 empty, 1 occupied. Inside the second, an infant girl, swaddled in a pale blue blanket, face red and wrinkled, eyes wide with the kind of fear only newborns carry. Nurses moved in the background, shadows more than people. Their faces blurred, their voices static. She walked toward the baby. The baby looked straight at her and cried. The sound ripped through her chest like a scream from her own throat. Then pain, bright, blinding. A white light from above, a surgical lamp. The scream changed pitch. Not the baby's scream, hers. She was lying down now, surrounded. Gloved hands pressed her into cold metal. A mask forced over her mouth. She's not stable. Wrong chart. Too late now. Make the cut. The blade touched her side, and everything went black. She woke with a gasp, sharp, wet, raw. Raymond was there, already beside her. He didn't touch her, just watched. Dream? He asked, softly. Lily blinked. She didn't answer. She turned her head toward the chapel door. Echo stood in the mist closer now. The fog clung to his mane, steam rising gently from his flanks, as if the horse itself breathed the memory. His one golden eye glowed as the lantern light from inside caught its edge. Lily stared. The horse blinked, then exhaled through his nostrils, long, low, steady. The sound filled the space like an echo from deep within the earth. She watched the steam curl toward the ceiling, then vanish. Raymond stood, walked back to the television, and turned the volume down. The news anchor had moved on. Weather now. But the screen still showed Dean Hart's face in the bottom corner, a picture of Lily beside it. Raymond stared at the screen a moment longer, then at the girl, and softly, like a man who didn't believe in coincidence, he whispered, "You're not his daughter." Lily turned slowly, her eyes wide, not in confusion, but recognition. Something had shattered, something had begun. The chapel was quiet, but not still. Rain had passed, leaving a damp hush in its wake. The stones beneath Raymond's boots were slick with moisture. Outside, the forest no longer howled, but listened. He stood at the far end of the chapel's rear room, a cold, musty space cluttered with old crates, medical supplies from another lifetime, and a thick wooden chest pushed against the wall like a forgotten coffin. The lock on the chest was broken years ago. He had never fixed it. Raymond knelt, hands weathered but firm, and lifted the lid with a grunt. The hinges groaned, their complaint muffled by time. Inside, files, envelopes, folders yellowed by mold and memory. He reached in, moved past the newer papers, past the wildlife permits, past the incident reports, deeper. His fingers found a thin sealed packet wrapped in wax cloth, faded medical stamp, handwritten initials, a single word scribbled across the top in blue marker, Bishop. His heart clenched not from fear, but from something colder. He opened it. Inside, a birth record, infant female. Date of birth, the 3rd of February, 2017. Hospital, St. Helena Regional. Name, Emily Claire Bishop. Mother, Samantha Bishop. Father, blank. Notes scribbled at the margins in shorthand, he recognized instantly. Medical terms, readings, blood compatibility concerns, surgical procedures unauthorized. He flipped to the second page. There, a photograph. worn. Glossy surface faded, but visible. A newborn wrapped in blue, eyes shut, a red tag on her wrist, and the nurse holding her. The woman was young, maybe late 20s, her face soft, almost round, red hair pulled into a tight braid, her hospital ID badge half visible, dangling just below her collar. He stared. The name on the badge was partially obscured, but one thing was clear: Clara. His hands trembled slightly. He remembered her. Nurse Clara Madsen, fresh out of training, first year in pediatrics, quiet, diligent, warm with the infants. She never stayed for the politics. She asked too many questions. Raymond had met her once. Then she vanished. 2 weeks after the Bishop child went missing. Hospital said she resigned. But there was no forwarding address. No paper trail. No obituary. Raymond leaned back against the wall. The photograph in his hand felt radioactive. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. This was a corpse wrapped in clean linens, a lie dressed as a father, a scream buried beneath 8 years of paperwork and pharmaceutical ink. He looked down at the name again, Emily Bishop, not Lily Hart. And the scar, it matched. He stood suddenly, the file still clutched in his fist. In the main chapel, the lantern flickered beside Lily's cot. She stirred, eyes half open. Raymond sat beside her. He didn't show her the file, not yet. Instead, he reached into the front of his coat and removed a smaller envelope. Inside, a Polaroid. He handed it to her. She blinked, took it with hesitant fingers, looked, paused, then looked again. "It's me," she said quietly. Her voice cracked like dry leaves. Raymond didn't answer. He watched her process it, not with the shock of discovery, but the slow, aching recognition of truth confirmed. "That's me." She pointed to the red-haired nurse. "I saw her," she whispered, "in the hallway." "A dream?" "No," her voice drifted. "A memory." Raymond sat back. "She tried to protect you." Lily looked up, her eyes wide, searching. "She's gone, isn't she?" Raymond nodded once. "They made her disappear because she asked the wrong questions." He stood and began to pace. "She knew what they were doing, not just to you but to others. You were a product, Lily, swapped, prepped, operated on. Your parents, your real ones, never stopped looking, but they were told you died." He turned, his voice lowered. "I was there, not directly. I was still a surgeon then, before." He didn't finish the sentence. His eyes found the cracked cross above the chapel's pulpit. "I left when I saw how deep it went." Lily stared down at the photo, her fingers pressed against the faded image, as if hoping to feel the woman's warmth. What now?" Raymond exhaled, long, measured. "I need to get you home," he said, "to the people who were meant to protect you. But Dean Hart, he's not your father." She shuddered. "I know," she whispered. Outside, Echo stepped closer to the chapel, pressing his muzzle against the frame. The wooden beam groaned under the weight, and the lantern's flame danced against the stone. Raymond approached the horse, ran a hand across the coarse fur between its eyes. "You knew," he murmured. "You always do." Echo blinked his golden eye. His breath steamed through the doorway, curling into the room like a spirit returning home. Raymond turned back to Lily. His voice sharpened not with anger, but with purpose. "You're not going back to them. Not to that man. Not to that woman." He opened a side cabinet beneath the altar, pulled out a wrapped canvas satchel, thick with dust. Inside, an old camera, documents, backup tapes, everything he had kept over the years. Secrets, proof, names. They were all coming with them. Because if they were going to burn the lie, they'd need firewood. He turned to her again. "You're not Lily anymore," he said gently. "But you're also not who they say you are." She tilted her head. "Then who am I?" He paused. "You're what they tried to erase." A flicker of a smile touched her lips. Only a flicker, but enough. The chapel had settled into an uneasy stillness, as if it too had overheard something it wasn't meant to. Outside, the sky had cleared just enough to let the moon breathe through the fog. Light filtered down in thin shafts, like heaven trying to apologize. Lily sat near the chapel's entrance now, her blanket draped loosely around her shoulders, legs crossed, her small hands resting on Echo's muzzle. The horse knelt beside her, still and solemn, his single golden eye locked on her face as if remembering someone he once knew. Raymond watched them from a distance. His arms were folded across his chest, his back resting against a wooden support beam. He wasn't ready to tell her everything, but some truths needed to be spoken aloud, before the silence swallowed them forever. "He was never meant to end up here," Raymond said finally. Lily turned her head slightly, eyes half closed, fingers still tangled gently in Echo's mane. Raymond took a slow breath. His name wasn't Echo back then. They called him Subject 12, one of a dozen therapy horses bred and conditioned in a private medical facility. Fancy words, hidden money. He stepped forward into the flickering lantern light, his shadow stretched across the chapel floor like a wound reopening. They called it a neurological resilience study, said it was to help kids with trauma, said the horses would be part of emotional integration. What they didn't say was the drugs were untested, experimental, illegally fast-tracked. He paused, eyes flickering. They used children like testing fields, infants with inconclusive guardianship, the ones nobody could trace, the ones like you. Lily said nothing. She didn't have to. Her fingers tightened on Echo's fur. He was there, Lily. He saw what they did. Horses remember more than we think. Pain, grief, patterns. He watched kids come and go. Some didn't leave. He exhaled slowly. He watched one girl scream every time the lights came on. Watched another stop speaking after injection round 4. He saw needles, screaming, restraints. Raymond's voice cracked. He saw you. The words floated there, hollow and unbearable. Lily turned back to Echo. Her hands shook, just slightly, but she didn't cry. Instead, she lowered her forehead gently to his. No words, no questions, just silence, and the sound of her breath melting into his. The lantern behind them flickered as if in response. And then, music. Soft, barely audible at first. An old melody from the chapel's forgotten piano, untouched for years, now resonating with haunting grace. Not played by hands, but imagined folded into the moment like memory pressing against reality. The music swelled, not orchestral, but intimate strings and quiet piano chords swelling into the space like water rising slowly, inevitably. Lily closed her eyes, and Echo remembered. And the refing their face premonition, all that is remonition's way in round the tanded, a flash of metal walls, fluorescent lighting stuttering above surgical tables, rows of cribs, babies swaddled and silent, some not moving. A red-haired nurse Clara walking with Echo down a narrow corridor, her palm pressed against his flank to calm his trembling. He was younger then, not yet wounded. Both eyes clear, her voice soft. It's okay, boy, just watch over her. Then, screaming, doctors in white coats pinning a small child to a table. The child's eyes, Lily's eyes, locked on Echo as she writhed under restraint, Clara rushing forward. You said she wasn't cleared. A hand shoved her back. Echo's hoof slammed against the ground. A shriek, an alarm. A needle shattered on the floor, and then, blood. Clara on the ground. A thin red line across her neck, and Echo, racing, hooves slipping, charging into the night through a steel gate left ajar, into cold, into forest, into exile. Way Wanner and 5 the Polis. There is Wanner's the Poldux. The music faded. Back in the chapel, Lily's hand gently brushed the long scar across Echo's left eye, the one that had blinded him. He flinched, but didn't pull away. Their breaths synchronized. In, out, in, out. She leaned closer, her whisper so soft it barely left her lips. I remember the light. Echo's ear twitched. Raymond approached them, holding something in his hands, a dusty brass lantern, relic of another time. He set it near the altar, where the cracked statue of Saint Gabriel loomed, its face weathered by time, its wings chipped, its eyes long faded. The light from Echo's one good eye caught the lantern's reflection, and for a single moment, a beam shot directly across the chapel. It passed Lily's face, past Raymond's shoulder, and landed squarely on the fractured statue's face, specifically across the eyes. The cracks seemed to glow. The saint's blind gaze bathed in golden light, holy, almost defiant. It wasn't divine. It was exposure. Raymond stepped back. His mouth tightened. That's what they never wanted, he murmured. For someone to see. Lily stood now. Echo behind her. She walked slowly toward the statue, her bandaged foot dragging slightly, but her steps were sure. She reached up, fingers brushing the edge of the glowing crack that split the statue's cheek. Then, with both hands, she pressed lightly, almost reverently, on the place where the eyes had once been. A small piece of stone crumbled away. Inside, tucked in a hollow cavity, was something hidden. She reached in, pulled it out. A silver medallion, with a name etched on the back. Clara Madsen. Raymond's eyes widened. How did that get there? Lily turned, held the medallion to her chest, then looked at Echo. He neighed once low and mournful. The chapel trembled with memory. Justice didn't need words, just witnesses who refused to forget. The light came from her voice before it came from the sky. Lily sat beneath the chapel's broken window, sunlight pouring through the fractured glass and pooling in patches on the stone floor. Dust swirled around her like suspended time. Her hands rested on Echo's side, rising and falling with each breath the horse took, slow, rhythmic, like a lullaby. And then, out of nowhere, she spoke. It wasn't a conversation. It was a melody, low, fragile, shaped like memory. Go to sleep, my little dove, where angels guard from up above. Raymond froze mid-step, His eyes widened. Her voice cracked, but she kept singing. The stars will kiss your dreams tonight, and morning brings the softest light. She stopped. Silence. Then she looked up. My mother used to sing that, she whispered. Raymond crouched in front of her, eyes suddenly wet. Do you remember her face? Lily shook her head. I remember her smell, like mint tea, and her hands. She had ink on her fingers. I think she was a writer. Raymond swallowed hard. That lullaby hadn't been heard since Clara vanished. And that name, it wasn't in any of the records. He rose, walked toward a cabinet, pulled out an old journal with yellowed edges. He opened to the back, where notes were scribbled in panic years ago. Clara's initials, Clara M., and a hastily written sentence. Warned me about bishop transfer, said it's bigger than I thought. Raymond's voice trembled. She tried to stop it, before they silenced her. Lily's gaze sharpened. She didn't make it, did she? We don't know, Raymond admitted. But there might be someone who does. Raiden. Wanet. The forest around Elkhorn still bore the weight of secrets, heavy with moss and wind. Raymond led Lily down a narrow dirt path Echo knew by memory, his hooves crunching softly over pine needles. The man they sought wasn't on any grid, no phone, no mailbox. Just Jesse Reed's The Last of the Old Woodcutters, and a ghost in the eyes of local authorities. They found him where the trees began to thin, an old cabin, squatting low in a hollow, stacked with split logs and the skeletons of past winters. Smoke rose gently from a chimney patched with tin and rust. Jesse was already outside, chopping wood, broad-shouldered, flannel shirt open at the neck, white beard down to his chest. His eyes, a stormy blue, flicked up the moment he heard the horse. Took you long enough, he muttered. Figured the ghost would come knocking sooner or later. Raymond dismounted first. Lily stayed on Echo, watching. You remember Clara? Raymond asked. Jesse lowered the axe. Redhead? Kind eyes? Didn't belong in a place like that? Raymond nodded. She ever talked to you? Jesse wiped sweat from his brow. Once. Said she saw something. Asked if I'd noticed strange activity up at the chapel after dark. I said no. He paused. But that was a lie. Lily leaned forward, her voice soft but sharp. What did you see? Jesse looked at her for a long time, then nodded toward the woods. Follow me. With axe ration been about noona. The trees thickened as they walked. Jesse moved like a man who knew when not to speak. His boots sank slightly into mud, his steps precise, rhythmic. Behind him, Raymond walked with Lily beside him, one hand on Echo's reins. Finally, Jesse stopped near a rusted chain fence wrapped in vines. This used to be a forestry checkpoint, he muttered. Then one day it wasn't. He pulled aside part of the fence and gestured them through. Beyond lay a clearing, overgrown, forgotten, and in its center, a concrete slab. Old root cellar? Raymond guessed. Not quite. Jesse knelt, scraped dirt away from a seam in the slab. Beneath it hinges, a door. He pulled, groaning with the effort, until a gust of cold, sterile air hissed from below. A stairwell descended into darkness. Raymond looked at Lily. She didn't flinch. They lit their lanterns, and entered. Reader, Ader, and minus leaf. Reader, Adder, Redder, in Redder. The air was stale and electric. The stairwell led down 30 feet into what had once been a medical supply storage converted from a World War II bunker. The walls were lined with rusted shelving, toppled gurneys, plastic bins warped with heat and time. Jesse led them to the far end of the bunker, where a steel door, half open, revealed another room. Inside, cabinets. Some open, some padlocked. Raymond tried one. It squeaked open. Inside, vials. Labels bleached, but legible. TRX. Noi Noi Neuro PHA. C. Human trial. His heart sank. He opened another drawer. Files. Fingers trembling, he flipped through the folders. Photographs. Children's faces. Notes in shorthand. Blood types. Dosage charts. Behavioral reports. And in the middle, a file labeled Bishop, Emily C. Lily gasped. Her picture was paperclipped to the file. Taken in a clinical setting. Her face pale, her wristband clearly labeled, a needle in her arm. Raymond dropped the file. This is what they buried. Now. Lily picked it up, held it to her chest. Echo, standing just outside the door, let out a long, haunting breath. It echoed through the chamber like the cry of a forgotten god. And then, Lily whispered, we show the world. Raymond turned to her. She looked different now, not afraid, awake. The air had turned colder, more metallic, as if the walls themselves had stored the fear of children who once breathed here. Raymond's flashlight beam swept across the moldy concrete, tracing faded numbers and rust-streaked bolts. Each corner seemed to whisper. But it wasn't wind, it was memory returning in fragments. Lily walked ahead of them all, her lantern trembling slightly in her hand. Echo trailed just behind her like a silent sentinel, every hoofstep measured, every movement haunted. They entered what appeared to be a collapsed corridor, half sealed, half buried by time and deliberate sabotage. It smelled of damp rot and iron. The ground was cracked, as if something had once clawed upward. Raymond crouched near a caved-in section of floor. His hand brushed over something soft, brittle. Paper? He pulled it free. A child's drawing, stick figures, a horse with one large eye, a girl in a hospital bed, a figure labeled Dr. G. The edges were singed. Jesse let out a slow breath behind them. Someone tried to burn it all, but not deep enough. Then, suddenly, Echo moved. Without warning, the horse scraped his hoof across the dirt. Once, twice. He stepped to the left, nostrils flaring, and began pawing at the ground insistently. Lily turned. Echo? He neighed low. Urgent. Raymond stepped beside him and knelt. As Echo scratched again, a glint emerged beneath the packed earth. Raymond dug with his bare hands. And there it was, a metal bracelet, infant-sized, still clasped, though dirt-caked. He wiped it slowly. Bishop, Emily, Dob 10/14. Lily gasped. She clutched her chest. Raymond held it out to her like a sacred relic. That's yours, he said. Tears welled in Lily's eyes, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, like her body already knew what her voice had never been allowed to speak. Then Jesse shouted from the far end of the corridor. Raymond, there's something else. They rushed over. Jesse pointed his flashlight into a fractured section of wall, where a crack had opened between rusted support beams. Inside was a long black case, half embedded in the concrete, wrapped in medical tape. Raymond reached in. The case was heavy. He opened it carefully. Inside, a blister pack of capsules marked TRX-91, the same name from earlier, but these were labeled Batch Alpha, Phase 0, and beside it a thin folder, unsealed. He opened it slowly. Inside were handwritten instructions, dosing charts, and a list of infants by name and blood type. Third on the list, Emily Bishop, assigned to Subject 1-2 Equine Linkage Trial. Raymond closed the folder, chest tightening. They were matching babies to animals, not for therapy, for conditioning. Jesse's jaw clenched. Like pairing prisoners with guards, Raymond nodded grimly. Or test subjects with instruments. Echo let out a low sound behind them, as if in response. Lily reached for the folder. Can we give this to someone? She asked. Raymond nodded. We have to. They left the corridor together, up the narrow stairs, into the night air, carrying more than just paper and pills. They carried truth, but truth always calls its enemies. That remember, and a master backed, and therein fell into erected phone, and then readily. That remember, and a master back, then a master back. End allis. Back inside the chapel, the storm had returned. Wind howled through the cracked stained glass, and rain ticked like bones against the tin roof. Raymond lit the old radio transmitter on the desk, an analog device powered by a car battery. No cell signal this deep, but the frequency still worked. He dialed in, a crackle, then a voice on the other end. Montana Division Dispatch. Identify? This is Raymond Keller. I have evidence pertaining to the 2014 child trafficking case, involving Emily Bishop. Silence. Then, please hold. 3 seconds passed. Then, a new voice. Deep, familiar. Well, Father Keller, I was wondering when you'd resurface. Raymond froze. Lily, seated by the fire, looked up at his expression. Who is it? She whispered. Raymond's face drained of color. It's him, the voice came through again. I assume you found the bracelet. Maybe even the pills. Doesn't matter. You've always been one for ghosts, Father. You just never knew when to let them stay dead. Raymond's hand tightened on the receiver. You orchestrated this from the beginning. The voice chuckled. Cold. Amused. Emily was just one of many. Disposable pieces in a very expensive game. But congratulations, you found your way to the bottom of the well. Too bad there's no rope to climb out, Raymond growled. She's not disposable. She's alive. And she remembers. Then I suggest you pray, the man said. Because there are people who won't let you walk away with what you've found. You think justice is waiting? All you've done is dig her grave. Then click. Silence. Raymond slowly lowered the radio. Lily stood now. He sounded like my dad. Raymond nodded. Because he is. But not your father. Not really. He turned to Jesse. We need to get her out of here, now. Jesse grabbed his coat. I'll ready the truck. Raymond walked over to Lily and knelt. Are you afraid? She shook her head. Not anymore. He smiled. Then handed her the bracelet. Then let's end what they started. It began with a spotlight. A long beam of white light slicing through the chapel's stained glass like a blade, turning angels red and saints into shadows. Then came the sirens, distant at first, then circling like wolves. Tires grinding gravel, doors slamming, the crunch of boots on wet dirt. The forest around Elkhorn Chapel held its breath. Inside, Raymond stared out the broken window. He didn't flinch. He had heard that sound before. Years ago, in another country, another war. Go, he said to Jessie. Take her. Through the cellar. You know the route. But Jessie didn't move, because Lily had already gone. She was one with Echo, now down in the dark again, where the earth remembered, where silence had held her captive and now cradled her like a witness. Raymond opened the door. The first flashlight blinded him. Hands where I can see them. Several officers rushed the entrance, bulletproof vests, helmets, weapons drawn. Behind them stood Martin Hart, Lily's supposed father, wearing a sheriff's badge he hadn't earned and a face stretched into mock concern. Where is she? He barked. Raymond said nothing. You kidnapped a minor. You trespassed on federal land. You tampered with restricted evidence. Raymond turned to face him fully. You mean I uncovered it? Martin stepped forward. Where's the girl? Raymond raised his hands. Safe, and not yours. He was tackled, handcuffed, dragged through the chapel like a criminal. Outside, cameras flashed. Local press. A few curious locals. Martin played the victim. My daughter was brainwashed. This man, he's dangerous. He lives off-grid, claims to be a priest, but he's not registered with any parish. He's filled her head with lies. This is a child abduction case, plain and simple. A female officer glanced at him. Something didn't sit right, but orders were orders. They raided the chapel, every corner, every crawl space. And then, they found the stairwell. What's this? Goes to a cellar, the captain gestured. Check it. 2 officers went down. Flashlights danced across the walls. Empty. The chamber below was silent until one of them stepped near the old rusted filing cabinet. A sudden metallic clang. A shudder. Then, from behind the far wall, something smashed outward. Wood splintered. Brick cracked. And there, through a hole Echo had made, Lily emerged, covered in dirt, clutching a rusted metal bracelet. And standing beside her, breath heavy, was the one-eyed horse, his coat shimmering like silver in the flashlight beams. The officer froze. Kid, stay right there. But Lily didn't. She stepped forward. Each step uncertain. Her knees shook. Her voice, gone for years now, carried not fear, but defiance. I'm not Lily Hart. Silence. I'm Emily Bishop. One of the reporters lowered his camera, stunned. Lily raised her left hand. The bracelet dangled from it. The name, the birth date, the blood type engraved in steel. The crowd shifted. I was taken when I was a baby. My real parents never found me. He lied, she said, pointing at Martin. He called me his daughter, but he drugged me, locked me in closets. He hurt me when I cried. He told people I was sick so no one would ask why I never smiled. Her voice cracked. But she didn't stop. This man, Father Raymond, he saved me, not just from the woods, from being lost. One of the officers spoke up, quietly. She matches the missing infant report. Bishop, Emily, 8 years ago. Case closed prematurely. Cause of death was presumed. Martin stepped forward, shaking. She's delusional. You can't trust. Echo stepped between them with a deafening scream, raising his hoof in a thunderous stomp. Martin stumbled back. The cameras rolled. The entire town was watching now. The officer closest to Lily knelt. Do you have any proof? She nodded. In the bunker, there are files, pills. There's a photo of me as a baby. You'll see it. Raymond, still on his knees, finally lifted his head. I told you, she's not a myth. She's the truth your system buried. Martin tried to speak again, but now no one listened. 2 officers entered the bunker. Within minutes, they returned holding the case of TRX-91 pills, the infant records, the photo of Clara holding newborn Emily. Everything snapped like dominoes. Martin's badge was confiscated. The arrest orders flipped, and Lily, shaking, covered in mud and truth, looked up at the camera with a voice that cracked the air. I'm not a lost child anymore. I'm just a girl who finally came home. And behind her, Echo lowered his head, his single eye reflecting not light, but peace. It began with a headline. Child swap scandal resurfaces after 8 years, missing girl found in Montana chapel. Then came the swarm. Journalists, investigators, DNA specialists, and one unexpected visitor with snow-white hair and a folder clenched to her chest like it held her remaining breath. Clara, the red-haired nurse who vanished the night the Bishop baby disappeared. She now sat in a wheelchair in a sunlit room at Whisper Pines Care Home, eyes flickering with guilt, clarity, and something fragile hope. A microphone waited. I remember the day they brought Emily in, the 15th of October, 2014. They told me her mother had complications, that she needed to be prepped for immediate transfer. But her voice shook. I saw the tag change. One nurse swapped wristbands. Just like that, a new baby placed in the cradle. I told my supervisor. They told me to forget it or I'd never work again. Why didn't you go to the police? I tried, she whispered. But someone followed me. There was a fire at my house, and then I just disappeared. I've been afraid for so long. The reporter leaned in. Why come forward now? Clara looked at the photograph she held in her lap. A young girl beside a one-eyed horse, mud on her face, fire in her eyes. Because she remembered. And so did the horse. Meanwhile, back in Helena, a courtroom was being hastily prepared. The man once known as Martin Hart, now revealed as Lucas Granger, a former administrator at the defunct Mount Vale Neurotherapy Center, was in custody, no longer shielded by false credentials, no longer smiling, but his eyes still burned with arrogance. Until the DNA tests came in. One drop of blood, one strand of hair, matched perfectly to the Bishop family. Emily Bishop was no longer a ghost file in a locked drawer. She was alive, standing in a courthouse hallway, her small hand holding Father Raymond's. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out the timeline, complete with old video footage, medical logs, and the recovered TRX-91 vials. They told the story of a center that experimented on children under the guise of therapeutic trials, of a black market identity laundering system that swapped infants for clinical data. But the story didn't move the room until Echo arrived. He stepped into the building on soft hooves, escorted carefully through a side corridor by two handlers from the Animal Rescue Foundation now protecting him. He didn't need a voice. He was the voice. His one eye scanned the courtroom as if searching for someone. Then it landed on Clara, brought in by the prosecution to testify. She gasped. "It's him. He was there. I saw him through the glass." Flashback, flickering across the screen for the viewers. Clara, in a white coat, standing at a window as a young Emily lay in a crib beside a pale horse in a pen, its eye covered in gauze, its body trembling with exposure. The judge allowed the photograph into evidence, and when Clara finished her statement, she turned to Lily and said, through tears, "I'm so sorry. I couldn't save you then. But I'm here now." Lily nodded, lips trembling. And, for the first time since the courtroom began, the room stood still. Outside, the news vans buzzed. Young survivor exposes child trafficking network through her bond with horse. Horse becomes witness in historic Montana case. The town of Elkhorn, once forgotten, became a name of reckoning. At the edge of it all, hidden from the flashbulbs and microphones, Father Raymond watched from the chapel, hands folded, eyes glistening. He didn't need to attend the trial. He had done his part. Lily was no longer the girl in the shadows. And Echo had become something more than a horse. He was memory incarnate, a living vessel of survival. Veterinarians confirmed the scars across Echo's back, matched restraining harnesses used in outdated neuromodulation procedures. His partial blindness wasn't congenital, it was trauma-induced. A result of prolonged exposure to UV lamps used in a misguided psychological experiment. Every scar on him told a chapter. But now, Echo stood on the green hills outside Elkhorn's wildlife sanctuary. The wind blowing through his mane, children visiting him like a legend. Raymond sat beside Lily on the chapel steps. "He's still afraid of sudden light," she whispered. Raymond nodded. "But he's not alone anymore." They looked out as a banner was raised across the sanctuary fence. The Echo Refuge for every survivor who was never believed. Justice, in the end, didn't come with fanfare. It came in truths unearthed, in voices found, in a one-eyed horse who once walked out of the mist and never turned away. The chapel still bore the cracks of the past lines running through its bricks like veins. But now, sunlight filtered through its broken windows, not as sorrow, but as promise. On the morning of the sanctuary's opening, Elkhorn's hills breathed with new life. Trucks rolled in from towns as far as Helena and Bozeman, not filled with tourists, but with animals silent, scarred, limping, frightened, rescued. Deer with broken legs, dogs with cigarette burns, horses with haunted eyes, all now part of something new. Elkhorn Sanctuary. The old church bell no longer tolled for mass. It now rang for healing. Raymond stood in front of the stone steps with a quiet grace. His once wild beard trimmed, his eyes softer, though one ear remained deaf. Time had weathered him, but Lily, now taller, stronger, her hair braided in two messy strands, stood beside him like a mirror of what love could salvage. They didn't speak much that morning. They didn't need to. All around them, volunteers hammered posts into the ground. Teens helped build wooden shelters for rabbits and raccoons. A small boy tied ribbons around a rescued goose's neck. Near the outer pasture, Echo stood on a small hill, watching. He was older now, slower, his mane streaked with time, but the wind still answered him. A child approached, perhaps 6 years old, holding a can of oats and trembling with hesitation. Echo didn't move. Instead, he waited, silent, calm. The child took another step, another. Then a hand met fur, and something invisible passed between them. Later that afternoon, the crowd gathered beneath a makeshift pavilion where the old altar had once stood. A microphone squeaked, a generator buzzed, but the murmurs hushed when Lily stepped forward, holding a folded piece of paper. She looked out at the crowd. Farmers, teachers, sheriffs, reporters, children, faces that once belonged to a world that forgot her, now here, to witness her rise. She unfolded the paper, took a breath, then looked up and let it go. I was once told that I didn't matter, that I was someone's burden, a mistake, a forgotten name in a hospital file. Silence. But I learned something in the forest, in the rain, in the eyes of a horse who had no reason to help me. She turned toward Echo, grazing at the edge of the crowd. Echo didn't see me as broken. He saw me as lost, and he came anyway. Her voice trembled, but held steady. Not everyone is born knowing who they are. Not everyone is born where they belong. But sometimes, if we're lucky, love finds us anyway. Through strangers, through animals, through people who stay even when the whole world runs. She gestured to the field behind her. This sanctuary isn't just for the abandoned. It's for the survivors. For those who made it through and don't know what comes next. She paused. Echo once walked me out of the forest. Today, I walk with him into something new. Thunderous applause. But it wasn't the clapping that mattered. It was the quiet after. The breath held by the wind. By sunset, the crowd had thinned. The banners fluttered gently. The last of the reporters packed their vans. Lily found herself on the chapel's rooftop, legs dangling over the ledge, looking west. Raymond joined her, carrying 2 mugs of cocoa. He handed her one. "You were brave," he said. She smirked. "No, I was terrified." "Same thing sometimes." They sat in silence. Below them, Echo wandered toward the tree line. He moved slower now, not with pain, but with peace. "What happens when he's gone?" she asked. Raymond didn't answer right away. "He won't be." Lily looked at him. He nodded at the sky. "Legends don't end. They echo." She laughed through a tear. As the final scene fades in, the camera moves slowly across the sanctuary. The new stables, the glowing lights on fences, children laughing beside the goats, the way volunteers gently treat a bird's wing. And then, we find Echo, standing on the ridge above the property, alone. His body is still strong, but his breath is deeper, as if the weight of years now settles gently on his back. He lifts his head toward the fading sun, half blind, but in his one good eye, light blooms. The golden sun reflects off it, catching dust in the air, bouncing between trees, turning the forest floor into gold. He steps forward once, twice, then stills. And in the stillness, we see it, a glint of memory, a flash of the little girl he once carried, a whisper that he was never just a horse. He was the path, the guide, the proof that loyalty doesn't need language. Final voiceover by Lily. Some memories fade, others dig their roots deep. Echo wasn't just my rescuer, he was my compass. And maybe, just maybe, the forest never forgot us either. Fade to black. Title card. For every soul who was silenced, may they one day be heard. The screen lingers one last time, on a single shot, Echo's silhouette against the sky, one eye closed, the other catching the last ray of light, then gone, but never lost.